Thank you, Lauren. It's wonderful to be here and a great privilege.
Thank you. Well, I want to get right into it. So we began this week with a conversation with your friend, Ellen MacArthur. You are our British bookends for this conference.
Really?
And she closed by saying that the most meaningful way to make progress on advancing the circular economy is for us to align around our vision for the future. That was her battle cry. That's how she landed. That's where we need to do next. How do we actually begin to envision and agree upon that ideal vision of the future when right now feels so uncertain and broken?
I think we've got a journey to go on. I don't think we jump straight to a clear, shared vision of the future. I think we still have quite a lot of experimentation to do. I think we still have quite a lot of exploration to do. But I don't think we get to align around things that we can't share, and we can't share things we can't imagine. And we can't imagine things that we can't visualize. And that's really a sort of a kind of a golden rule of design, is that what design does, if anything, and by visualize, I mean describe. It doesn't have to be pictures, but we describe things in the future in order to make them relevant in the present. That's what design does. It's one of the kind of fundamental definitions of design, if you like. And that's what we have to do lots of, and it's happened before. Maybe not at the scale that it needs to happen right now. Maybe not around such a kind of complex set of interlocking systems in the way that we're having to think about right now. But it's happened before. And one of the examples that really inspired me, actually, very early on in that 33-year career that you mentioned in the intro, was a glorious piece, I think, of imagining the future that came out of Apple in the early days. And I'm not talking about that wonderful 1984 video, although that was pretty cool. But soon after that, or a little while after that, the late 80s, early 90s, they produced a piece of imaginary work that was called Knowledge Navigator. And it was a video of the future. And it imagined what the world would be like if we could bring computing, mobility, and content and entertainment and communications all together. Now, today, of course, we totally live in that world. It's what our Android phones and our iPhones and our iPads, and that's what that does. Back then, none of that existed. No mobile phones were those clunky things the size of, typewriters, and we hadn't imagined anything that we have today. And but that video, and it was a short video, a few minutes, imagined what that world would look like if that were possible. And it aligned not only that company around a strategy that led to what was first something called the Newton, and then ultimately the iPhone, the iPad, and the iPod, but it aligned a whole industry, a set of industries actually, around what the future might look like. And I think we have the opportunity, the necessity to do the same thing around many, many different aspects of what the circular economy needs to be. Now, as I say, it's more complex now. These systems are more complex. We need many, many more stakeholders to get aligned, but we have shown examples of it in the past.
Well, one piece of this, and a theme that's come up quite a bit this week, that I wonder if it was a part of that video years ago, this theme is around equity and the need to build a circular economy that works for everyone. So I'm wondering, how do we approach human-centered design, which is something that you, of course, think and do a lot, when humans have such different needs and starting points? And really, how do we think about building this new system that's inclusive when so many people have been left out of that process in the first place?
I think you've really identified the key. It's about inclusion in the process as much as it is inclusion in the end result. I think we have often thought in the past that human-centered design is about designing products initially, then services and experiences, to include as many ideas about what different kinds of customers might need or different kinds of users might need. But the truth is, if we're going to move towards a more kind of equitable end result in terms of these systems, we actually have to include more people in the process of design. And we have to move, and we are moving towards approaches to design that are more community-based, to the realization, for instance, that systems don't get designed and then launched. systems get constantly redesigned. I mean, this is what we're talking about. I mean, this, in some ways, the confusion and the struggle we have with circular economy, like so many systems, is that we can't stop the existing system, turn the switch off, design a new thing that we think is about as good as it could ever be, and then launch it. That just isn't the way the world works in this. We have to be working in and around and at the edges of the system constantly and changing it constantly, and it will never stop, right? And so that's the nature of systems design. And I think that leads us to the inevitable conclusion that the people in the system, which in the case of circular economy means all of us, have to find ways to participate in the process of redesigning that system. And as I say, we're beginning to find ways to do that, to open up the design process, whether it's around food systems or packaging systems, whatever it might be, to include many, many more people in the design process.
Well, there's a fundamental shift in there from a leadership mindset perspective. I mean, if you look at the breakdown of this conference here, we've got 3/4 of folks coming from for-profit companies, 1/4 of those companies having over $1 billion in annual revenue. So there's some major purchasing and decision-making power here. And something that comes up time and time again is when corporate leaders are making these decisions and shifting kind of away from business as usual, there's design constraints that feel really immovable, whether it's feeling beholden to shareholder value or stuck in their business model. So how do you see companies shifting from that really consumer-centric innovation, consumer-centric approach to one that's more system-centric and one that is more inclusive of more people within that system?
Well, one shift that we're already seeing, and I think it was mentioned more than once earlier on in this event, is that organizations are beginning to collaborate with themselves, with each other, right? I mean, that's not going the whole way in terms of what you just talked about, but it's a start. I mean, we've been fortunate to be working alongside closed loop partners in some interesting new programs. One around replacing the disposable shopping bag, beyond the bag challenge that's live right now. But previous to that, worked on something around replacing the disposable coffee cup. In both cases, those programs are really enabled by a collaboration of some of these major corporations that you talk about. In the case of Beyond the Bag, it's organizations like Walmart and Target, Kroger's, CVS, very large organizations that are normally kind of competing tooth and nail, who are realizing that they need to collaborate in order to explore, enable, fund new solutions to some of these large-scale systemic challenges. So I think we're seeing more and more of that collaboration, cooperation going on. Some of it very much upstream, kind of pre-competitive, if you like. Perhaps some of it more downstream in terms of setting standards for how some of our systems need to work. So that, I think, is one example of a kind of a change in the way some of these innovation practices are going on.
I'm curious, beyond the bag and beyond the cup, if there's any specific product or piece of this broader world that you think is really ripe for a redesign and a reimagination through a more circular lens.
I mean, to be honest, I almost can't think of a part of our society that doesn't need that reimagination. It's one of the things that makes me extremely excited as a designer, and realize that, there's many careers worth of design to do for many, many, many people. I mean, I encourage everybody, every young kid I meet who's interested in design, to think about getting into the world of design, simply because there's so many problems to solve. I'm one area that I happen to work in quite a lot is in health, and I do think that's a system that's ripe for not only transformation and change, but also change through a circular lens. There are some very difficult challenges in health. For instance, health is built on a disposable, kind of linear disposable approach in so many parts of the way healthcare is delivered today. In some cases, for safety reasons, but that's a hard bit to tackle. But there are other aspects of health, particularly the connectivity between our food systems and our health, our everyday behaviors and our health, which are where it's possible to imagine change, possible to imagine new approaches which are in themselves regenerative. I think of almost, what we need to be imagining for the future are regenerative life experiences, where we connect things like consumption of food with health, with economics as well, how affordable things need to be. Coming back to the equity issue, we cannot be designing systems that are only available for the wealthiest or only available to those that have large employers that can afford to provide them as part of their overall compensation package. As more and more people work to kind of gig style work practices and those kinds of things, we have to find ways of making these things kind of financially available.
How do you reconcile the difference between incremental change and, I mean, healthcare system has been the same for a long time, and I think it's very ripe for disruption, but a disruptive approach to health is rather slow, I would say. So how do you think about, what needs to happen right now, what we need to just burn down and rebuild, and what we're doing day after day to move things more slowly?
I don't know about you, but I've been thinking a lot about systems change in the last 6 months because of what's going on around the pandemic. And I don't consider myself to be a deep expert on complex systems. I've read quite a bit about them. I've been working in them for a while, but it seems to me that there are two forces for change when it comes to a system. One is outside in, and the other is inside out. If you to put it very simplistically, the inside out one, which is we see the need for change. We're in a system. We see the need to change for it. And that inside out approach is what I think of as it's essentially activism, right? It's stating how that system needs to change in a way that's compelling enough that the players in the system begin to change. That's the role of people like Ellen and Ellen MacArthur and you all at with a conference like Circularity and so many others. That tends to be that's hard work. It tends to be incremental at the beginning and then builds up pace over time. The other kind of change is the stuff that happens outside in, and that's what happens when the conditions in which a system exists change rapidly for some reason. That's exactly what's going on with healthcare right now with the pandemic. We're seeing these radical shifts in the conditions in which healthcare exists. We're seeing, for instance, the connectivity between individual health and public health in a way that we had just lost sight of. And realizing that for instance, that people's economic situation, whether or not they have chronic conditions, adds up to the impact that it has on our total public health, right? So we in the US, for instance, are struggling because, to be honest, the kind of base status of our health is not as good as it needs to be in compared to other countries. But we also see, we also see other things. So, for instance, the system has shifted so radically that it's made certain solutions suddenly available that weren't available before. Telemedicine is a good example. Within 2 weeks after the pandemic hit, laws changed in Washington to make telemedicine payable by insurance companies. They would actually pay to have in a way that had taken 5 years of effort and not actually made happen before through activism, if you like. And so telemedicine is accelerating hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars investment going into telemedicine that wasn't happening 6 months ago. That's interesting because that's an outside-in, non-incremental impact on a system.
So you're talking about the conditions changing quickly, but you're not talking just about conditions that are pandemic and kind of out of our hands. Can we actually change the conditions to make the change happen quicker?
Yes, I mean, we'll go back to where we started. We can make the change happen quicker when we've prepared ourselves for that change by thinking about it before we get there, right? By imagining the future before we get there, so that we sort of know what we want. Because another thing that happens when you get rapid change in conditions is a tendency to run around like we're chickens with our heads cut off, not knowing where to go. And unfortunately, what then happens is often a kind of a reaction back to the comfort of the status quo. We try and hang on to the status quo. But if we know what we want to head to, then there's a chance that we'll go in that direction. And I think one of the things we're seeing in the conversation about building back better at the moment is that because these ideas of the circular economy are now getting better and understood, and we know the kinds of things we're looking for, there's a much better chance we'll head towards them. And the more imagining of the future we can do, the more describing of the things we'd like to see, whether it's the way we'd like our cities to operate, the way we'd like our food systems to operate, the way we'd like our health system to operate, the more likely we are to move in that direction when the opportunity arises.
So well said, as always. We are getting a lot of audience questions right now, so I want to invite back up Editorial Director for GreenBiz, Heather Clancy, to bring us one of those questions. Heather.
Yes, this is so hard. Which question is it? This one I really love. Can you speak to unintended consequences? Right. So computers have enabled so much, but led to massive amounts of e-waste. What have you learned about including the unknown unknowns in the design process?
My experience is there's only one way to include the unknown unknowns in the design process, and that's to design and then find out what they are. Because they're, by definition, if they're unknown unknowns, you can't build them into the design spec, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what you can do is design it into the process. And what I mean by that is the faster you iterate, the earlier you prototype and learn from the real world rather than just what your imagination tells you, the faster you'll discover what these unknown unknowns are. Now, that doesn't mean to say you'll always be able to respond to them. And sometimes the momentum of a certain piece of innovation or change is kind of unstoppable. And I think we can see that a little bit with social media and the unintended consequences of innovation in social media were very hard to stop. And instead, we actually just have to kind of charge on past and try and evolve our approaches. And that's often the role of regulation. I mean, and that's the other thing, that by prototyping earlier, we allow ourselves to see where we need to regulate or where we need to level the playing field. And I think that any systems change, there's a very important role for regulation, but it is not, in my opinion, to write the design specs. That is not the role for regulation, because we nearly always get it wrong because we don't understand what the consequence is going to be. But it is to respond as we learn. And I think there's a lot of interesting experimentation going on around the world today. Some of it driven by the World Economic Forum, for instance, through their Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution, looking at how to write policy differently in response to technology innovation rather than only in anticipation of it. So anyway, building it into the process, being iterative, learning fast, and then responding is the only way that I know of dealing with the unknown unknowns.
Heather, I think we have time for one more audience question if you have another.
Good. Well, I will admit to my age, I remember the Knowledge Navigator. So the question goes back to, how do we get the next generation of designers to really prioritize this way of thinking? So what can we do now to educate the up and coming and those in the field today to think differently?
I think they already are, largely. I mean, I think the current generation of designers have several things that arguably my generation, our generation didn't have. One is they've been exposed to these ideas right from the very beginning of their experience of design or experience of anything. Secondly, they're so much better connected because of the very innovations we were just talking about around social media and communications. And thirdly, because that's mostly the climate crisis, but so many others, they understand the need that our current systems are no longer fit for purpose. And so they're not only looking to make change and looking to design this change, but we're, I think we're beginning to see examples of it. I mean, one of the reasons that I think we felt good about the work that happened through the Next Gen Cup Challenge and the Bag Challenge is that by going out into the world and looking for the best ideas that are already coming up from entrepreneurs and then helping them get better through design, and we're seeing so many great solutions out there that need to scale, that need to have the opportunity to connect to some of these larger corporations. And there's a wealth of new ideas emerging. And there are also some very exciting technology innovations that are coming along, which will give this generation even more opportunity to innovate.
Such as?
Well, two areas that I'm excited. I mean, of course, material science, and what I think will be some major breakthroughs in material science over the next few decades. But the second one, strangely enough, is purely in the world of pure digital. I'm very excited about the innovations that are coming from the world of crypto and blockchain and things like that, and starting to see new kinds of organizations, this idea of distributed autonomous organizations, which allow new forms of cooperatives to exist, where you get participation, you get trust, and you get groups of people able to do things that we couldn't organize before. They're an alternative to the classic corporate ways of organizing, and I think we're going to start to see new cooperatives emerge in areas like food. We're already seeing, and food supply. We're already seeing it in areas of things like talent, and the way talent comes together. I think over the next few years, we're going to see some very exciting new kinds of organizations appear, new kinds of cooperatives and collaboratives appear, who'll be bringing new solutions to market in a way that's inherently more circular, I think.
Thank you for those questions, Heather. Tim, something that I either read or heard you say recently, I really liked. You said that the appropriate unit of exploration is the question and not the solution. So as we think about ending this 3 days of this conference and moving out of this container into our jobs, into our lives, and back into the hard work of systems change, what questions should we be asking ourselves right now?
There's a lot of them, I suspect. One that's come up for me recently. I know the topic of kind of metrics and measurements come up quite a bit this week. I find myself wondering about the question of how might we measure kind of regenerative efficiency. And I know that's a sort of slightly weird combination of words because we tend to think of regenerative as not being all about efficiency. And linear is a bit more about efficiency. But I think there's a notion of, I think we need the circular economy's version of Moore's law. Just as a bit of a stat here, which I'm sure many people know, but 1962, the first integrated circuit had 16 transistors on it. By 2016, we were managing 25 million transistors per square millimeter. So the efficiency of computing went up by, I don't even know how many million times that is, but it's a lot. I think regenerative approaches are inherently more efficient when we think about it in a systems way, and we need ways to measure that. So I find myself wondering about that. Another question, which we've touched on a little earlier today in our talk, is the question of how do we collectively design for a regenerative and circular future, rather than imagine it's an individual's role or a corporation's role or anybody's individual role. How do we find ways to imagine and work collectively? I think if we come at the problem with a mindset of a collective mindset, we will discover interesting solutions. And then I suppose another area that I find myself often wondering about is what's the right way to tell stories of circularity? It's very tempting to try and tell the iconic story of the wonderful single idea created by a wonderful little startup that's going to change the world, because that's the way we've told stories about innovation for so long. It's kind of inappropriate when we think about a system. And yet when we start talking about systems, we get lost in the complexity. We sometimes get a bit lost in the science, and we don't evoke people's emotions. And when we do evoke people's emotions, we sometimes do it through fear rather than kind of optimism. And we need a bit of both, probably. So I do believe that the question of how do we evoke people's emotions, how do we connect to them, how do we make the future exciting as well as a little bit intimidating and daunting, but how do we make it also exciting, so that we head towards the future with energy and enthusiasm and determination, because we need determination, but energy and enthusiasm and not simply fear.
I can't think of a better way to close out this conversation. We are unfortunately out of time. Tim, thank you so much for joining us for the end of circularity. This has been such a wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. It's been a great pleasure. I've really enjoyed being with you.